Looking to faith leaders for a message of hope and some guidance during times of crisis. Our next guest says that churches need to do more to prepare for and respond to racial crises in the communities and congregations. He explores how to do that, really lays out a plan in his new book, There's a Storm Coming, How the American Church Can Lead Through Times of Racial Crisis. With me now is author and pastor, Reverend Dorrell Briscoe. Pastor, good to see you again.
Great to see you, sir.
So let's start here. We've talked a lot about the sectors of criminal justice and housing and education and healthcare and how they can contribute to fixing this breach or closing it. You say, and your book takes a very narrow focus on the church and their communities. Set the scope for us first.
Absolutely. My book is called There's a Storm Coming. I grew up in Florida, and if you grew up in Florida, you know that when someone says to you, there's a storm coming, that means there's a hurricane somewhere in the Atlantic or in the Gulf, and you've got to take proactive measures to be prepared. Well, it's the same thing with the church. There are storms that are hitting our country. They are creating an enormous amount of shock, division, rage, at systemic injustice and racism. And so the church needs to be prepared by working for justice, by collaborating with community stakeholders and preparing for these crises so they'll be in a better position to respond to, lead through, and learn from these crises.
So you've got 4 steps here, and you've got what's called your institutional mitigation of racialized tragedies. Let's put it up, because it starts with the realization. You've got to get congregations, and I understand from the conversations between our producers and you that, and our conversations actually on social media, that this is geared toward white congregation specifically, starting with realization. What's that phase look like?
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a great question. Realization is simply becoming aware. It's an education process where white pastors, faith leaders, take proactive steps to learn about America's historical record on race, about systemic inequalities that are affecting us today, and to listen to the lived experience of Black people. When they do that, I truly believe that they'll be informed in their leadership when it comes to these crises. And
we've seen some people hold up the signs that say we all bleed red, or you speak to white allies at these events and say color doesn't matter. You write that color blindness is not the right approach. Why?
Absolutely. Color blindness is an ideology that essentially says, I don't see color. And let me tell you, that does a disservice, because if you don't see my color, you don't understand the lived experience that my color brings me in this country. And so instead, and I think Austin Channing Brown talks about this in her book, it is important for us to be color conscious, to celebrate the rich tapestry of colors and diversity that God has created here on this earth.
Next step is readiness.
Absolutely. Readiness is where we become aware, and that's where we start to learn from other community stakeholders, listen to them, and begin to do the work of justice in our communities. That's when we get our boots on the ground. We designate a certain portion of our budget to fund organizations that are working for justice for Black people. But we've got to get ready and realize that our socio-political climate has changed drastically over the last 12 years. We've got to get ready for these storms.
How do you get buy-in for this? Because now, instead of we've gotten beyond realization, I've explained what the problem is, but when you start talking budgets, and this is going to cost this congregation or my family, then you're talking a different commitment. How do you get people to buy in?
Well, hopefully you can echo the words of Jesus, who said that we need to count the cost. We've got to realize that when it comes to freedom and equality, that's never easy. But the reality is, I'm encouraged by a lot of white faith leaders, a lot of white Christians. I'm seeing a groundswell of support across America where they're finally waking up and realizing that, it's not just about us getting along. It's about working for the flourishing of Black people in this country.
Responsiveness, what's that look like?
That's very important. Too often when it comes to racialized crises, what we're experiencing right now with the death of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, too oftentimes faith leaders are silent or indifferent. And I think it is vital for us to use our platform and our pulpit to speak out and speak up against injustice in America with moral clarity, with decisiveness. We need to engage in truth-telling. We've got to tell the truth about America's historical record on race, and not be afraid to offend people. Communicate with grace and truth. It's very important.
And renewal.
Renewal. That's, when it comes to hurricanes, I worked in public policy before ministry, so that's where this framework comes from. But you don't just try to bounce back from the storm. You want to bounce forward. You want to learn. You want to learn about your capacity as an organization. It's the same thing with the church. What can we learn from these crises? What needs to change in our context, in our community? That's important. We have to look at these as catalytic events that can truly change us and help us change our communities.
Which is why when I look at this model, it's just coming to me now when you say this, we don't want to bounce back, we bounce forward, that this is cyclical. It's not linear. You take that renewal element and add it to the next chapter of the realization. Pastor Dorrell, again, good to see you again. The book is There's a Storm Coming, How the American Church Can Lead Through Times of Racial Crisis. Thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Christy?
Victor, I love when we have a segment. I feel like I just went to church.
Well, amen.
It's Sunday morning.
Yes.
I love it. Listen, how we speak to our kids, that can be a real key to see